Thanks to Tom Foreman for that. Well, joining us now, Middle East expert Lisa Daftari, the editor-in-chief of the Foreign Desk, and former FBI Special Agent Errol Southers, the director of Homegrown Violent Extremism Studies at the University of Southern California. And joining us from Palm Springs, former FBI Special Agent Bobby Chacon. Welcome to all of you. Bobby, to start with you first, this suspect originally hailed from Uzbekistan, came to the U.S. Some 7 years ago. All eyes now on the Uzbeki community. They're, of course, they're in the country, and obviously the community as it exists here in the U.S. They're known to be incredibly insular, as said by our own Bob Baer. How do investigators approach, this community? How do you approach such a proposition when you know that the people you need help from are remarkably insular and in some cases hostile to the West?
Well, there's a number of ways you do it. Community outreach. There's both overt and covert ways to infiltrate a community like that. I would think that the FBI's New York office and the JTTF there has already made some inroads, because this is not the first time we've had an Uzbeki actor in New York. There was one back in 2015 where several Uzbekis were arrested in Brooklyn. So I think that they may have already started that. And that's part of the job of the JTTF, is to keep those contacts within those communities. When something like this happens, they can turn back to. Very difficult, but certainly not impossible.
So, Bobby, why are these people so closed off? Why is the Uzbek community so isolated and so difficult to crack?
Well, I mean, originally, they are a kind of a remote region of the former Soviet Union, and I think they broke away. They got their freedom in 1991, and then they've been living under a pretty severe dictatorship there. So, these are people that are used to having very dominant governments over them, and so they're very, that breeds an insulation, whereas the community doesn't want to be too open, because they've been cracked down either by the former Soviet Union or by their new so-called freedom, which is now a dictator. So I think that their political history and the dominance of the leaders of the political history, I think, kind of further their insulation.
Errol, to bring you in here, Bobby just mentioned that this isn't the first instance where we've heard of Uzbek males being involved in acts of terror. So I guess my question to you is the path to radicalization for Uzbek men the same as it is for other migrant communities here in the U.S., or is there something unique at play here?
It could be something that's unique, but I doubt it. It would seem that the path is probably very similar. It's a community that's somewhat insular. We see that. We've seen it here. We see it in other communities around the world. But as Bobby also mentioned, the relationship that's going to be required for an investigation to take place doesn't happen today. It needs to be in place already. And the challenge that I have with that is our policies lately are suggesting that we marginalize these communities that we do need to work with. We've had a program here in the United States called CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, and that program has been under fire for a number of years in the past administration and now into the current administration. And what it does is it isolates individual communities in this country based on religion, based on national origin. You can't ask those people to help you later when you particularly label them as suspects consistently until something happens.
Errol, it's often been remarked that the problem of radicalization in the U.S. is nothing compared to the problem of radicalization in Europe. Are you saying it's because of programs like that one, or is it more to do with U.S. society, for example, compared to the European society? And if that program goes away, are you looking to move towards the European situation?
I think it's much more to do with our ability to assimilate here. I spend a lot of time in Europe, particularly in France, and I've seen those communities. It's a very, very different situation. I've seen fourth and fifth generation French individuals be challenged on their national heritage when they've been born in France. We don't have that here. If you come to America, everybody has the American dream. It doesn't matter where you're from. And in those countries, they don't live that same kind of opportunity or that same kind of hope. So we're very fortunate here that we have it this way. We don't want to have to revert it to a system that puts us in the situation they have in France.
Well, Lisa, the president tweeted this. He said, "We must not allow ISIS to return or enter our country after defeating them in the Middle East and elsewhere enough." That was as part of the number of tweets he put out in the aftermath of this attack. Immediately bringing ISIS, immediately talking about defeating them in the Middle East and elsewhere, and the flourish there at the end. Isn't he missing the point? isn't he missing the point about the complexities here at play in terms of radicalization and terror, that it can be homegrown? It's not just a notion of people coming from outside.
Sure, but at the same time, he's coming off of the victory of Raqqa, and that was the big success, and that was, so far in terms of foreign policy, probably the biggest jewel in his crown.
But they're not defeated, they're just not in Raqqa.
Right, but meaning let's follow that momentum. Saying if we are going after ISIS on the ground, we're also going against ISIS and fighting them when they're entering this country by influence. And they obviously are entering the country by influence. This guy was here for 7 years. I don't think on a daily basis this guy was thinking about, you know, the caliphate back in Syria and Iraq. He wasn't. He was thinking about getting on probably YouTube or getting on, you know, meeting a friend at Starbucks or whatever coffee shop and talking about these things. And that's what leads to radicalization. And I think what any president or any leader at this point can do is to unite the country. Not to put people on a marginalized list, but to say, Muslims, Jews, Christians, and atheists died on 9/11, and anyone was at risk today. Meaning our Muslims are at risk, our Jews are, everybody's at risk, and we want to keep all Americans who are on this soil safe. And I think that's the message maybe perhaps that's missing, that this is more of an inclusive thing. And if we're going to be proactive about fighting terrorism, it's not a partisan issue. Immigration is about national security. National security is not a partisan issue. So when can Americans come together and not make this a political issue today and make it one that we can go forward and make this country safer?
And just to follow up on the tweet about that message that, you know, we won the war with ISIS, that was actually one of the expressed concerns that came out of the Pentagon and the intelligence services, that, you know, people would say, oh, Raqqa has fallen, we've won, yay, the war is over.
We talked about this
on
the
exactly.
show.
And then all this complacency was set in.
Right.
I guess, you know, they just never expected it to come from the president.
Right, but at the same time, I think there is a plan in place. And that plan's not going to take place overnight in order to take out ISIS. ISIS is like putting, you know, feather pillows into the wind and then trying to catch all those feathers. You're not going to be able to do that. And you're not going to be able to do it so expressly. So I think that to keep the momentum, to keep this fight against ISIS or any other radical individual or group that wants to launch an attack on U.S. soil, we're going to fight them. And I think that that's the comprehensive message today.
The only thing I would say to that, and I agree, is that we have to understand, as you've mentioned, we have a homegrown problem here. We have had 750,000 refugees settling in the United States since 9/11. 3 people have been arrested for a plot, not an attack, a plot. So it would seem that vetting works. So when you say extreme vetting to communities that are here, to people that have been here, the average person who comes here, and I work with communities in Minnesota, the average person that's coming in, say, for example, from Somalia, spends 8 years in a refugee camp in Kenya. The vetting system works. We don't need super vetting. So when you make statements like that, and now you speculate on how we're doing so well, to me, it not only marginalizes communities, it politicizes an issue. We have a homegrown issue here. And if we look at numbers and statistics of attacks that have happened in the last 10 years, whether they be quote-unquote jihadist attacks or white supremacist attacks, these people are Americans, and in large numbers they're born here. These are not refugees and not immigrants.
Why the reticence to recognize what the data clearly bears out?
Well, it's clearly political. We live in a country of otherism. We want to believe we have a faraway threat, we have an other religion, another race, another nationality, another ethnic origin. That's comfortable for America. We are very, very hesitant to actually embrace the fact that Americans kill other Americans more often than anybody else.
Sure, but
so I just want to ask Bobby this question, because Bobby's, you know, former FBI, and you know, what's the bigger threat? Homegrown radicalized jihadist terrorists, or white guys born here, aged, you know, young white men with a gun who've got some kind of issue to prove?
Well, I mean, by sheer numbers, if you look at the numbers, it's the latter of your description, right? But we've all been whipped up into a fervor about radical Islamization, and so I think the terrorist label brings a certain amount of emotional cachet to an argument, and so I think that, you know, it's hard when we're not addressing everything in equal measure according to the proportion of danger to us. So I think that you know, I think that the latter group is probably more of a danger, you know, the average American citizen. But you know, neither can be ignored. And I think that I think the doctor's right. I think there's ways to reach out to those communities.